Huh? It's a what? A super weapon. A super weapon, huh? To end the war. To end the war. Yeah. You know, we've seen a whole bunch of those, haven't we? And they never ended the war, right? I mean, they never ended the war, no matter what Hitler or anybody said they were going to do. Okay. No. Okay, listen. What are the tests like on this new super weapon? I mean, what do they show? Huh? They haven't even tested it yet. Okay. Yeah, color me skeptical. No, color me unimpressed. Okay. June 1st, 1945. What if you were at war and had a super weapon? Or you might have a super weapon. You don't know yet because it hasn't been tested. But if you did, would you use it instead of conventional means of warfare? Because what would such a use involve? Well, you better have a big meeting with all the top players and try to figure that out. That meeting happens this week. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the fighting in Europe came to an end 2 weeks after the war officially ended there. Heinrich Himmler was arrested but managed to commit suicide. The fight on Tarakan Island continued, and the Japanese were withdrawing on Okinawa and losing a fight in China. Also last week, Curtis LeMay sent American B-29s against Tokyo again and again, laying waste to the city and killing tens of thousands of Japanese, although the pilots of the 21st Bomber Command are specifically ordered not to bomb near the palace, since Emperor Hirohito may one day be an asset and he is not yet a liability. Tokyo Radio still broadcasts stuff like this to whoever's left. Why should we be afraid of air raids? The big sky is protected by iron defenses. For young and old, it is time to stand up. We are loaded with the honor of defending the homeland. Come on, enemy planes. Come on many times. Tokyo is no longer on the bombing list. There isn't much point, really. There are other cities to bomb, though. This week on the 29th, 517 B-29s carry out a daylight raid on Yokohama, the big port city, dropping 3,500 tons of incendiaries. They turn like 85% of the city into smoking ruins. Devastation like this suggests to LeMay and some of the other Joint Chiefs that it can't be that long until the Japanese government accepts unconditional surrender. But they are wrong. Well, not about the general situation, just the response. The destruction was indeed causing concern to Suzuki's cabinet. Before the resumption of the firebombing, the Prime Minister had set up a planning board of military and civilian experts to assess how much damage they could take and still go on fighting. The report was bleaker than even the most die-hard militarist in his cabinet had anticipated. Hardest hit were the heavy industries that were essential to sustain the faltering war machine. Steel production had dropped to less than 2/3 of the official minimum quotas. Aircraft production had fallen to 1/3 because of aluminum shortages. Less than 1 million tons of shipping remained. All of it was blockaded due to coastal operation by the Allies' aircraft and submarines. Internal railway and road transport was on the verge of collapse from bombing. However, for the Supreme War Council, surrender is inconceivable. They have a 3 million man army and over 9,000 planes left with willing kamikaze pilots. Now, when Germany surrendered, Suzuki had thoughts of a possible face-saving peace through the Soviet government, who are neutral with respect to Japan at the moment. And maybe that way they could at least keep part of their empire. Suzuki is warned by members of his government, however, that the price exacted by Joseph Stalin for negotiating such a peace would be much beyond our imagination. And that may well be right, just looking at the map of Eastern Europe this month. They'd obviously have to give up most of Manchuria and even Port Arthur, and who knows what more. So Korochika Anami, the Minister of War, is busy organizing a volunteer people's army. And as June gets going, Suzuki bows to pressure from the militarists and accepts the army's plans, endorsed by Hirohito, to fight the war to the bitter end. Everyone seems to be inspired by the Okinawa garrison, still fighting after a couple months against insurmountable odds, but still refusing to give in. Here is the situation on Okinawa. We saw last week that Mitsuru Ushijima began moving his men out of the formidable Shuri Castle defenses to avoid being surrounded and then bombarded into dust. U.S. 10th Army Aerial Recon saw extensive troop movement, but they couldn't believe the Japanese would ever retreat from Shuri. But they were, and they are. Well, by now they've finished, and the Americans have understood that. So instead of heading west to finish surrounding Shuri, the 7th Division holds at Chinan Peninsula in case of any Japanese forces in the hills or on the northern shore there. To the west across the island, south of Naha, is the Oroku Peninsula, and 2 regiments from the 6th Marine Division plan an amphibious landing there for next week. That division also takes the Sugarloaf position this week on the 26th, by the way, after 10 days of fighting, most of it in the rain. Naha itself falls the 29th. That same day, 1st Battalion 5th Marine Division crosses into 77th Division sector and takes Shuri Castle. The Army's really happy about that. 77th takes Shuri town. The withdrawals from Shuri actually went like this. As last week ended, Japanese 62nd Division made its withdrawal through the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade southeast of Naha, and this week establishes a line in the rear. Japanese 24th Division withdraws this week to a line east from south of Itoman on the west coast. Then the 31st, the 44th IMB withdraws to make a line with the 24th that goes to the east coast. 62nd Division then makes a fighting withdrawal through this line as the week ends and next week begins. The Army commanders pulled out of Shuri on the 27th. General Ushijima struck out alone, on foot, walking down a rocky trail in darkness. Staff officers, attempting to keep up with him, stumbled and fell, bruising themselves badly. The route was strewn with dead Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians, many of whom had been putrefying in the open air for a long time. The naval base force on Oroku Peninsula misunderstands their orders and withdraws too early, the 28th. They don't like their new positions though, so they return to their base, some 5,000 strong, preferring to die defending it than to retreat and die alongside the Japanese army. So by today, Japanese 32nd Army has successfully executed its withdrawal, though of 50,000 troops when the operation began, they are down to 30,000 or so. Any wounded still capable of fighting have been left behind to fight with the rearguard, and the seriously wounded have been killed. I have to point out that even with just a rearguard, the taking of Shuri is no easy task. It is brutal. The rains cut visibility to a few meters max. The roads are basically impassable, and the rearguard fights ferociously and dies to the last man. On May 31st, American Commander Simon Buckner reports that the Marines are scrambling over what's left of Shuri Castle. It's all over now, bar the cleaning up of pockets of resistance. He is very much mistaken. Though, across the Pacific, people are meeting to discuss another possible way to make the whole war all over now. The Interim Committee meets. This is chaired by American Secretary of War Henry Stimson and includes James Burns, head of the Office of War Mobilization, which oversaw resources for the Manhattan Project, Ralph Bard, Undersecretary of the Navy, William Clayton, Assistant Secretary of State, Vannevar Bush, Director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, Carl Compton, Field Service Chief of that institute, James Conant, Chairman of the National Defense Research Committee, and George Harrison, Assistant to Stimson. Burns is President Harry Truman's personal representative. There are also American scientists there to discuss their progress. Progress on what? These guys meet at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. to decide if and when their new super weapon, an atomic bomb, will be dropped on Japan. In the official minutes of the meeting, scientist Robert Oppenheimer describes the explosion. The visual effect of an atomic bomb would be tremendous. It would be accompanied by a brilliant luminescence which would rise to a height of 10,000 to 20,000 feet. The neutron effect of the explosion would be dangerous to life for a radius of at least 2/3 of a mile. Stimson agrees with Dr. Conant that the most desirable target would be a vital war plant employing a large number of workers and closely surrounded by workers' houses. Burns meets with Truman later that day, taking the decision to use the bomb to him for approval. Burns writes this of their discussion: Mr. Truman told me he had been giving serious thought to the subject for many days, having been informed as to the investigation of the committee and the consideration of alternate plans, and that with reluctance he had to agree that he could think of no alternative, and found himself in accord with what I told him the committee was going to recommend. As we've seen, the alternate plans are for either a long siege of Japan and constant aerial bombardment, or physically invading the Japanese home islands. First Kyushu in November, and then the much larger Honshu in spring 1946. The worry with that is that the Japanese fight mostly to the death, with 20,000 Japanese dead causing 30,000 American casualties on Iwo Jima, and the ongoing fight on Okinawa having caused already that many more. So the 3 million or so soldiers on the home islands will quite likely cause as many as 1 million, or maybe much more, American dead. So forcing a surrender with the atomic bomb before a November invasion might save all those lives and shorten the war dramatically. Of course, such a bomb has not even been tested yet, but it is a new school of thought to use it, assuming the tests are positive, without warning and against a population center. Or call it an evolution of thought. Even as late as May 29th, when U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall meets with Stimson, Marshall is in favor of a demonstration bombing of Japan after warning the locals to evacuate the target areas before choosing one of them to hit. He is worried about, in his words, the opprobrium which might follow from an ill-considered employment of such force if they don't warn the Japanese. He also tells Stimson, interestingly enough, that the Army is actively investigating other means of dealing with a defense like on Okinawa, fanatical but hopeless. One of the proposals is just saturating military targets with mustard gas. But he's well aware that might not fly well with the American public, though he notes the character of the weapon was no less humane than phosphorus and flamethrowers. But both the ideas of warning the locals and the chemical warfare alternative have really mostly been abandoned by the start of June. We did specials on both the Manhattan Project and on the actual bomb building process or processes, so I won't get into that again here. But Oppenheimer's team is confident they can reach the critical mass needed to set off an explosive chain reaction that would generate the force of thousands of tons of TNT. They actually have 2 bombs, as the bomb building special describes. One using uranium-235 and one using plutonium. They are planning a bomb test in July, the Trinity test, to take place in remote Alamogordos, New Mexico. Although the scientists are currently racing to make that deadline. If successful, they say they'll be able to deploy bombs on Japan in August. I did mention last week that after a directive the last day of the week, the 25th, Chester Nimitz and Douglas MacArthur finally had enough guidance to begin planning the physical invasion of Kyushu, because until such time as this super weapon is available for use, invasion is plan numero uno. MacArthur has a first draft ready already this week on the 28th, but I will talk about that next week. For with the following notes, this week of the war is over. In China on the 26th, the Japanese evacuate Nanning, which means losing their direct link through China to Indochina. The Chinese quickly reoccupy it. On the 27th, Bull Halsey arrives to take over the 5th Fleet from Ray Spruance. John McCain takes over the Fast Carrier Task Force from Mark Misher, and the 5th Fleet again becomes the 3rd Fleet, and Task Force 58 becomes Taffy 38. Ian Toll writes this: the command turnover had occurred a month earlier than planned. The reason, never publicized, was that Nimitz and King wanted their first team of Spruance, Misher, and Turner in command during the Olympic landings on Kyushu the following November. To maintain the 5-month rotating command cycle, it was necessary to bring Halsey and McCain back early. There's a change in Japanese naval command as well, as on the 29th, Jisaburo Ozawa replaces Soemu Toyoda as commander of the combined fleet. Toyoda replaces Koshiro Oikawa as naval chief of staff, who has resigned. On the 28th, Lord Haw Haw, William Joyce, is arrested by 2 British officers at Flensburg. Joyce has spent the past few years broadcasting as Lord Haw Haw from Germany. His broadcasts were propaganda designed to demoralize the Allies, frequently reporting high casualty rates among Allied planes shot down or ships sunk. A lot of Allied soldiers and many civilians listened to him regularly, though, because his broadcasts often contain the only details available from behind enemy lines about the fate of, for example, friends or relatives who did not return from Allied bombing raids. He has a German military passport in his real name on him and a civilian document in the name Wilhelm Hansen. And here's something else that happens this week. Truman really wants to sort things out with the Soviets. I've talked a lot about the stuff post-Yalta with Poland and more over the past couple months. And he has sent Harry Hopkins to the USSR to meet with Joseph Stalin. Hopkins was a close advisor of Franklin Roosevelt's when he was president, particularly with respect to foreign policy and Lend-Lease, and was in the USSR in the summer of 1941 when the Axis invaded. He's been chosen now partly as a symbol to show that Truman isn't going to change foreign policy abruptly. I mean, he's been president just 7 weeks or so since Roosevelt died. Well, Hopkins is on a mission to convince Stalin to broaden the composition of the Polish government. And I've talked several times about the big issue about that between Stalin, the Poles, the British, and the Americans. But also to confirm that, as Stalin pledged at Yalta in February, the USSR would go to war with Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. This week on the 30th, Hopkins reports that Stalin agrees to a broadening of Poland's national unity government. He also agrees to the voting formula suggested by the Americans for the United Nations Security Council. But most importantly for Truman just now, Joseph Stalin assures Harry Hopkins that the Soviet Union will be in a state of war with Japan by early August. Also, that they will only deal with Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist government and not Mao Zedong's Chinese communist government. And I'll have a bunch to say about those two in coming weeks. But again, not now, because my point is this. Harry Truman is overjoyed by this news, and because of that, he thinks that a conference to discuss how the Allies will end the war with Japan and post-war issues in Europe is now worthwhile. And so he agrees to meet with the British and the Soviets at Potsdam, just outside Berlin, in mid-July. This is around when that superweapon test is to happen. I don't know if this is foreshadowing or not, but it might be. In just a few days, June 6th, it will be 1 year since the Allies invaded Normandy, which together with the Soviet Operation Bagration formed the largest pincer movement in history. Some of you will remember that we did a separate channel, D-Day 24 Hours, covering those landings and covering much, much more, hour by hour as they happen. You can watch all that magnificence right here. Everything we produce, everything, we're able to do thanks to the Time Ghost Army. That's what keeps the lights on. These are the newest commissioned officers in the Army, and Lorenzo Schiacci is the Army member. Lorenzo Schiacci is the Army Member of the Week, and you can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.